Politics, Mando Style. =RK equals. Part 9. Brox's Bar. Sundari. Mandalore. It's good to see you again. I smiled. Then I frowned, when Bo leaned forward and I could see her face clearly. I wish I could say the same. Chris grumbled, while playing with a cup of steaming caf. The woman looked rather worse to wear. Her hair was a disheveled mess. Her face was gaunt and pale. That only made the huge black bags under her bloodshot eyes stand off like roadside signs. Did you try to drink a platoon under the table or something? I asked and sat down across the table from Bo-Katan. It sounded like a good idea at the time. She gave me a tired smile. It usually does, right until the hangover hits. Don't I know it? Bo sighed and took a sip from her drink. How do you like today's Mandalore? She asked morosely. My answer is going to make Jabba the Hutt blush. I deadpanned. I can see that. Damn. Whatever had happened in the last few months had shaken her to the core. You know, I didn't imagine us meeting again like this. I muttered. How so? I expected that you'd want a rematch after you were loaded for Sith. I smiled. It's been a very long time since I fought a Mandalorian warrior who was prepared to face one of my kind. The thought did cross my mind. Her lips twitched upwards. The implications, however. Bo shrugged. One of these days I may take you up on that. Oh. She was a Mandalorian. Right. Well. A sparring match with one of her culture could have various implications, some much more important and complicated than others. What? Did I make the big bat Sith speechless? Well, my Mando courting ritual's a bit rusty. Did you just say that you would try to kick my ass and drag me to bed afterwards? If you're particularly good boy. Bo-Katan smirked. Or bad, depending on the situation. I smiled back. It was good to see the spark of life back in her eyes. We'll see. I'm looking forward fighting beside you again. And I hope that would be the case instead of facing you for one last time. The smile and any good cheer I felt bled off me. It was time for Bo-Katan to choose her side. I hoped it would be mine. No more idle chat, eh? Bo finished her caf and looked me in the eyes. You were right, she sighed and slumped back in her seat. The Death Watch. They're no honorable warriors. Slavery, drugs, extortion, common murder, smuggling, take your pick, Bo hissed like an angry snake. Looking back, a lot of my job's for them. She trailed off and shook her head. I've tarnished my honor, my clan's honor almost as much as my sister does. That explains a lot. Satine? I don't think you could have possibly criffed up as much as she did. I had a chat with her earlier today, you know. While I criffed up my honor, at least I didn't spit on all that means to be a Mandalorian, Bo laughed bitterly. Yes. She messed up pretty badly. That's an understatement. The Mandalorian woman whispered darkly. You've seen what I sent you. The Death Watch are growing in strength. Warriors are falling over themselves to join without knowing what they are doing. It's all her fault. All? That's a bit much, don't you think? Thanks to my sister Boat spat, there's no other credible alternative. No one else to rally us. In my time I would have expected that the Mandalorians would know better. The Death Watch betrayed the last true Mandalorian warriors at the end of your civil war. What makes you all think that they won't do it again? What? Bo hissed. I thought it was common knowledge. Vishla, the previous leader of the Death Watch, informed the Republic where the remaining true Mandalorians would be. They sent a Jedi task force which ambushed them. Only one man got away. How do you know that? The Jedi archives. I persuaded them to give me access so I could catch up on history and see what happened with my friends and comrades back in my day. Naturally, the history of Stephen's people was something high up on my list. Do you have proof? Who's Stephen? It's back on the Chimera in orbit. I pointed up. As for Stephen Ordo. We ran into each other more than a few times and become friends. Shortly after the war went hot, he became Mandalore the Dauntless after his predecessor was assassinated by a Jedi strike team. Criff me sideways. You were the Black Knight? Bo stared at me as if I suddenly grew another head. Stephen's to blame for that. I had nothing to do with that nickname. I can't say if you're criffing with me or if you're telling the truth. We both know that I can't possibly prove who I am. Not beyond a shadow of a doubt. I shrugged. That was the truth after all. You can't, can you? Bo's enthusiasm took a nosedive. Then she grinned at me. We're going to have our spa sooner than later. Combat is the purest expression of oneself. Her eyes gleamed with excitement. I didn't know you subscribed to Ekani teachings. Some. Grandma was one before she became one of us. What's with women trying to kill me lately? You're aware that I'm not a Mandalorian, right? Not yet. Bo beamed at me. You might be one when I'm done with you. Oh. I suddenly felt like a steak served to a hungry lioness. You're presuming you could win this time. I smiled back. We'll see who's the hunter and who's the hunted. This time I know who and what I'm facing. Damn. She was serious. Unless the Mando culture had radically changed. Crafit. There were certain things expected of you if you hooked up with a Mandalorian. Like becoming one. Mind you, I was interested in Bo-Katan. She was a fascinating woman, a great warrior, with fiery temper and a figure to die for. Then there was Shark T, my maybe lover too. I was most definitely interested in her, though I still didn't know if it was because of herself or because of her resemblance to my late wife. How the crift did I get myself in this mess anyway? Damn it, this was going to further complicate the situation. Do you really? I teased. I couldn't help myself and started digging a deeper hole. Well, I'll know for sure when I'm done with you, Bo declared cheekily. She sighed. However, I don't believe you called me just to arrange for our spark. I'm glad you've seen the Death Watch for what they're. I would hate to see you on the wrong side of the battlefield. Me too. Bo muttered softly. Though it would have been a battle to remember. She perked up. Mandalorians. You're better apprised of the local situation than me. How long until your former colleagues could try seizing power and succeed? I spoke quietly. Direct action? 2-3 weeks tops. The old-fashioned way? A few months unless the government falls, then much sooner. Sooner it is. Satine's position won't survive the pressure of the Republican sis. Well, I expected that the Republic would be supporting her. Bo leaned forward. That's certainly a surprise. It's a mess. I'm the Republic negotiator. Unless Mandalore allies with us, I'm to remove it as a threat, I whispered. That certainly shocked Bo. The blood drained from her face. She was one of the few people who not only knew that I was a Sith of old, but believed it beyond a shadow of a doubt. She knew that I wasn't bluffing or exaggerating. I could feel her shock. Soon it was supplanted by a silver of fear, but mostly anger. Damn, she looked like a vengeful goddess of war when angry. Then the Death Watch needs to go, Bo stated flatly. My thoughts exactly. =RK=. Part 10. Royal Gardens. Sundari Royal Palace. Sundari. Mandalore. Flowers from all over the galaxy thrived under the protection of environmental shields. Their alcoves were separated by alleys lined up with carefully trimmed bushes, which were barely tall enough to reach Kenobi's knees. The place was breathtaking, yet Obi-Wan barely noticed. He had eyes only for Satine, who was radiating so much anger that the Jedi could swear that he could see. The Duchess suddenly stopped and turned to face him. What was that? Satine snapped and pointed an accusing finger at his chest. You're supposed to be a Jedi? Her eyes flashed with unbound fury. A representative of the Republic. Satine actually poked him in the chest. Yet, you just stood there while that man threatened to burn Mandalore. The Duchess hissed. Obi-Wan averted his eyes. She was right. Yet it was no longer so simple. What would you have me do, Satine? Kenobi sighed. You're right. He raised his hands in surrender. As a Jedi, I should be doing what's best for peace. I should be doing my best to protect Mandalore. That gave Satine pause. Her fury subdued to merely boiling anger. Yet, you said nothing to contradict that man. She growled. I'm a Jedi. A sword protector of the Republic. What am I supposed to do when in order to preserve it I may have to ensure that Mandalore doesn't become a threat in this war? Obi-Wan exclaimed. We're no threat. We're peaceful people, Satine exclaimed. You are. The new Mandalorians too. Kenobi nodded at her, while speaking softly. I can't say the same about the Death Watch and everyone supporting them. Satine recoiled as if he just slapped her. Damn them. The Duchess hissed. Damn the warrior culture that still haunt us. Obi-Wan had to take a step back from the sheer loathing that Satine radiated for a moment. Her shoulders slumped and she stared at the floor. Will you allow it then? Will you simply watch my world burn and do nothing if the warmongers prevail? I don't know. I don't know what to do. Obi-Wan admitted. I'm a Jedi. A general serving the Republic, he laughed sadly. It should have been easy, to do the right thing. Instead, he trailed off. As a Jedi, as a general, I would have to prevent Mandalore joining the enemy and becoming another threat by any means necessary. As a Jedi, I should be seeking a peaceful resolution of this conflict. Bombarding, much less burning down this world should have been unthinkable, Kenobi shouted. The Republic. Satine trailed off. What about it? The Republic I know wouldn't condone destroying a world because it might be a threat. That's what the Separatists would do. Fear. Desperation. Obi-Wan shrugged. Take your pick. The Republic hasn't been the same since Naboo and Coruscant. We all made mistakes. We lost our way. That would be a cold comfort for my people. I know. We, the Jedi, no longer control the army. If we ever did. Obi-Wan sighed. The best we could do is try mitigating the damage and try to end the conflict as soon as possible. That's it? Satine exclaimed. It is. Obi-Wan smiled sadly. We can no longer stop the war, if we ever could. We don't have the influence to prevent the Senate and Gar High Command from carrying out a plan if they're determined to execute it. We can only quit and then we would have no say at all in how this conflict is prosecuted. Satine simply stared at him. Her eyes were wide with disbelief. We made too many mistakes. While a significant number of generals are Jedi nowadays, we have much less say in strategy and tactics than we had when the war started. We lost a lot of our credibility and influence. Instead you're all following a Sith, Satine snapped. Kenobi nodded numbly. How can you justify it? Del Qatar wins. He's one of the main reasons why we didn't lose dozens more Jedi when the temple was attacked. Most importantly, he's not as limited as we are when fighting the war is concerned. It's not that he's a better general, though he is for now at least, it's the fact that he can implement tactics and strategies that are usually unthinkable for Jedi like me. He fights and commands like a monster. That's one way of putting it. It's true. Satine, on Geonosis he ordered orbital strikes on towns and cities where the enemy was either hiding or had installations. Millions died, yet not a single non-Jedi officer had a problem with that. If we went in there to clean those places in a way that any Jedi, myself included, would have deemed acceptable, I know it was wrong. I could feel all those people die. Obi-Wan shouted. He was shaking with emotions he could no longer suppress. Satine stared at him in shock. Why? She whispered after they were silent for a couple of minutes. Why didn't I protest? Why didn't I stop the slaughter? Obi-Wan grimaced. Doing so would have broken our army. Hundreds of thousands soldiers would have died. It might have doomed us in the long term. The Separatists could replace their losses faster than we can. If the ground forces we led on Geonosis were lost, Kenobi sighed. Besides, doing so would have meant betraying every man and woman who followed us down on Geonosis, every sentient fighting for the Republic across the galaxy. That's not what a Jedi should be thinking, Satine whispered. No. It's what a general should think when he considers throwing an army into the meat grinder. Obi-Wan muttered. He had to fight to keep away flashbacks of Ryloth and the way he let down his men. What about you, Obi-Wan? Not the Jedi. Satine came a step closer. Not the general. Another one, and she was almost touching him. What about the man standing in front of me? What do you want? What do you fight for? She asked and stared in his eyes. Her feelings were confused. Obi-Wan could feel her subduing anger, confusion, fear for her world and people. Longing. What do I want? Kenobi muttered. That was a question he hadn't asked himself in a very long time. There was always something more important to deal with rather than seek an answer for that particular question. I want the war to end. He stared in Satine's eyes. Obi-Wan trailed off and leaned over her. Their lips touched and Kenobi was lost to the taste of vanilla. Mandalorian Dreams. =RK=. Part 1. Brox's Bar. Sundari. Mandalore. How did you make the Republic find its balls? Bo-Katan asked me after a few seconds of silence. That was all the September's doing. They made my life much easier. Yes. They apparently had the childish notion that they can attack, bomb and enslave, yet no one would be doing the same to them and their allies. The red-headed woman chuckled humorlessly. It's too bad that my world might burn as an object lesson. Not if I have anything to say about it. You're in charge. So don't bomb us to the Stone Age if certain idiots join the Separatists. Bo smiled at me. That's something I can't do even if you're the one asking. Too bad. Perhaps after I handle your ass? Perhaps. Do you have credible proof about your friend's extracurricular activities? A bit. Not enough to bring them down. Bo-Katan pouted. However, enough to convince you? More than enough. She glared at the table. Are you ready to join me? We have a lot to do. Bo looked me in the eyes and nodded. I stood up and offered her my hand when the Force screamed a warning. I moved without thinking and tackled Bo, who was too surprised and slowed down by the hangover to offer any real resistance. Acting on a combination of instinct and experience, I used the telekinesis to flip the table and place it between us and the rest of the bar. In the same time I grabbed the Force and put it as a barrier. The world ended in thundering roar and a wave of fire. RK equals. It's confirmed, boss. She's meeting that Republic General. Goran Kranz, one of the Death Watch's old hands, spoke clearly in the comm unit of his helmet. He and his squad of warriors had been keeping an eye on Bo-Katan ever since she came back from Ryloth and started nosing around. Their leader found her new hobby interesting and charged Kranz's mercenaries to find out what it was all about. At the beginning, actually trailing her without being noticed proved to be very hard. They often had to abandon the hunt or be detected. Fortunately, a couple of months later, Katan started getting a bit sloppy. That coincided with her finding about some of the more sensitive activities of the Death Watch. Goran still didn't see what the problem was. Their organization had bills that needed paying and some of the jobs came with delicious benefits. For some reason, Bo-Katan didn't agree. No one would have really cared. It wasn't like their membership was to the death or something. Unless you decided to betray the Death Watch. Unfortunately for Bo-Katan, she did so. Kranz was the first one to actually catch her sent a heavily encrypted transmission through the hollow net. That by itself wasn't too suspicious, though with Katan snooping around. The second transmission had been detected, copied and after a few weeks under the mercies of Death Watch decryption specialists, read. The first sign of alarm was the encryption. It was undoubtedly GAR, but much better than anything the organization had tried to break before. The contents of the message, a list of the lucrative businesses run by the Death Watch, sealed Bo-Katan's fate. That's why she was sent to a suicide mission in Hutt space leading a squad of green warriors. Then she had the temerity to succeed. After that, the traitorous woman had been busy trying to drown herself in a booze. Kranz had been ready to try taking her out himself, when she had gotten a hollow call. From what little he was able to overhear, whoever she's been selling the Death Watch to would be arriving soon. That bought her a bit of time. When Goran brought that bit of info to the leader, he ordered Kranz to wait until the meeting took place, find out who was Katan's accomplice and call back. I see. Is your squad in position? Kranz glanced around the small apartment they had rented across the street from Katan's favorite bar. His warriors were lounging in the living room clad in their armors and armed to the teeth. We're ready. Take them out. It will be a pleasure. We have green light. Goran announced once the connection with command was cut. It's criffing time. Mac, the demo expert of their small band, grumbled. A pity. I quite liked her. How? Their pilot and sniper quipped. You just wanted to fuck her. The only woman in the group, Dora, sneered. That's what I said. How shrugged. Enough. We have to deal with a Sith wannabe, Kranz snapped, making his people chuckle. Dora, how? The speeder and heavy repeater. Mac, put a rocket in the bar on my signal. The rest of you, come with me. A few minutes later, Goran was across the street from the bar. He was flanked by Torn and Leo, the close combat specialists. The speeder that would be providing getaway was parked next to them and Dora was in the back, ready to open the side door and let loose with the repeater. Mac was still upstairs, where he had a rocket launcher ready. Kranz nodded to his men and they took cover behind the speeder. Do it, he ordered. A moment later, an AP rocket roared above their heads and struck the heavy door of the bar. The obstacle, along with a large section of the surrounding walls, simply ceased to exist. Before anyone knew what was happening, Mac shot an He warhead into the bar. The following explosion turned the interior into a slaughterhouse. Without waiting for a prompt, Dora opened the speeder's door and lit up the bar with a heavy repeater. All that would have been an overkill against most people. Kranz knew better. He made a hand gesture and threw a pair of sonic grenades into the bar. His men followed suit a moment later. That should have been enough to disorient even a Force adept. Then a spread of frag grenades followed, while Mac repelled from the apartment. Goran slammed his fist in the side of the speeder 3 times and Dora stopped firing. She shoved the repeater aside, grabbed her rifle and jumped out. Kranz shouldered his heavy blaster rifle and gestured his squad to move in. It was time to make sure that Bo-Katan and her buddy were vaporized. =RK=, Part 2, Brox's Bar, Sundari, Mandalore. A spread of concussion grenades detonated moments before Kranz and his squad stormed the burning bar. Goran led the way, trusting that his armor can take a shot or two if any one of the patrons had survived the onslaught, no matter how unlikely it was. Dora and Mac dashed left, while remaining men swept right. The sensors in Goran's helmet allowed him to see clearly despite the smoke filling up the burning bar. Kranz smiled once he saw that there was no one moving and he allowed himself to examine the place. Most of the furniture sans the bar plot was wrecked, tables and chairs were torn to shreds, a few were actually melted too. The same could be said for the patrons. Those who wore armor were relatively intact, the rest, well, they were literally blown to pieces, their blood was coating the floor and walls. So much for that so-called Sith, Max sneered. True. No one could have survived this. Dora nodded. She was looked at a fully armored Mandalorian warrior, who had been caught in the crossfire. His armor was heavily dented and she could see blood leaking from cracks in the helmet. That was the most intact corpse in the room. Find and vape the targets, then we're gone. Goran ordered. He didn't feel like playing with the security forces. The boss wanted a relatively clean op. Dora never finished her sentence. Before she or Mac could react, they were swept away by a table that was warped and full with holes. The improvised projectile caught Leo in the shoulder and threw him over the bar. Goran and Theo wasted no time. They dived to the debris and blood-covered floor, then opened fire at the corner where the table stood. Kranz cursed when every shot was met and deflected by an angry crimson blade. He looked up and saw the man wielding it. It was that Republic general and he looked furious. Mow them down, Goran shouted and aimed at the hilt, that at least would make it almost impossible to deflect the shots back at him. Dora didn't bother getting up. Instead, she shot a missile from her wrist-mounted launcher. Kranz could see a look of contempt passing through the Force user's face. The man flicked his fingers in a dismissive gesture. The rocket that was almost upon him made an almost 180-degree turn and roared back at the Mandalorians. Sith spar. Theo's scream was cut short by a deafening explosion. The shockwave scattered the Mandalorians. It shoved and dragged Goran over the floor. He barely kept his gun and wits. A moment later he was up on one knee and shooting, while ignoring the ringing in his ears. The sound dampeners in his helmet saved his hearing, but were unable to totally compensate for the almost point-blank explosion. Dora slammed into him with enough momentum to make him dizzy. Kranz blinked stars away. Then he did so again, because he was seeing purple. Then he heard Leo's inhuman screams. He looked left and blanched. Leo was suspended in mid-air by a torrent of lighting that was running up and down his armor, which was melting. Max sent a pair of blaster shots at the Republic scum that was murdering Goran's team, though it was futile. The shots were deflected in an almost lazy manner, before another figure rose from behind the general. Kranz snarled as he saw the traitor alive and unharmed. Katan didn't have a scratch on her, the bitch. Her appearance kicked Goran's mind back into high gear and he jumped up on his feet. Kranz had lost his rifle so pulled a heavy blaster pistol, then charged the Sith. He hoped to distract him, giving either Mac or Dora a chance. Instead, Bo-Katan drew her pistols and opened fire. A moment later, Mac went down under a hail of bullets. Goran snarled. His shots were battered away, however he was close enough. A flick of the wrist and the flamethrower built in his left arm guard roared to life and sent a stream of liquid fire at the Jedi Sith. The man in black smirked and raised a hand in a halting gesture. The torrent of fire met an invisible wall and was harmlessly redirected at the ceiling. In the same time, Katan saw Dora, who was still dizzy, and shot her like a dog. 2 baleful yellow eyes stared straight into Kranz's soul. The Mandalorian's fingers became soft like butter and he dropped down his blaster. He felt his body being squeezed by an industrial press, before a lance of lighting slammed him into the far wall. RK equals. I let the concentrated lighting storm go. The assassin I caught with it fell to the ground and continued to bake under his half-melted armor. Are you all right? I asked Bo, despite feeling her bright presence in the force behind me. I'll live. She groaned. Another armored Mandalorian charged through the door and opened fire. I deflected his shots and glared at him. He took one good look at the carnage, dropped his rifle and dashed back through the door. Oh, no, you don't, I snapped and charged after him. The man dived in the driver's seat of a nearby large speeder, which had its side door opened. The machine was already running, so it took him a single moment to try driving away. No, I hissed and raised a hand. The speeder's engine strained, struggling against my telekinetic grip, and lost. I let my lightsaber go and guided it back into my robes, then I raised my right hand and concentrated. I let the dark side flow through me, then channeled its energies into my right palm. A few seconds later, a meter-long spear of pure dark side energy materialized in my hand, making my skin tingle with power. I threw the projectile at the struggling speeder. The Mandalorian jumped away in the last second. The dark spear tore through the speeder as if it was made of cardboard, passed through the driver's seat and slashed the power cell. A moment later, the machine spluttered and died. The last assassin found his balls, drew a blaster pistol and opened fire at me. I sneered at the criffing bastard and pointed my right hand at him. It was still covered with dark side energies, which I reinforced, before slapping away the blaster bolts screaming at me. It was time for a lesson. I concentrated and pulled even more energy in myself. When the next shot came, I extended my will over it and placed it into a force-derived stasis field, then I crushed the blaster pistol shooting at me and the hand holding it. The Mandalorian screamed in pain, but despite the ruined arm, his attention was stuck on the last blaster bolt, its hand frozen in mid-flight. It was jibing an unpleasant buzzing sound as its energies struggled against the stasis field. Well, that's new. Bo-Katan whistled from behind. I glanced back to see her dragging the assassin's leader. Her emerald eyes were fixed on the blaster bolt and she had a hungry smile on her face. Mandalorian Dreams. RK equals. Part 3. Brox's Bar. Sundari. Mandalore. I looked at the gathering crowd around us. More than a half of the people were armed and armored Mandalorians. The local security services were arriving too, though most were slowed down by the people surrounding us. The Mandalorians were radiating anger, curiosity, some even disgust. A lot obviously didn't like the fact that someone started open warfare in their capital, without warning and inviting them. Others were appalled at the sight, though they were a distinct minority of the people gathering here. What the criff did you do to my bar? A deep voice shouted above the whispers of the locals. A barrel-chested armored Mandalorian shoved his way through the crowd until he could clearly see the demolished building behind us. Hi, Brox. Bo waved cheerfully. This is exactly what it looks like. You and the rest of the Death Watch fools got too drunk and shoot up my bar? The 2 meters tall Mandalorian rumbled and pointed an accusing finger at my companion. He paid no heed to the would-be assassin I had suspended in the air or the hovering blaster bolt. You walked straight into this one, I chuckled. Who the criff are you? Brox growled and turned his helmeted head my way. General Delcatar Vale, the Dark Lord of the Sith, at your services. I gave him a respectful nod. Those idiots, I pointed at the Death Watch wannabe with the crushed hand, tried to assassinate my friend over there and me. They weren't up to the task. I shrugged. It was a pathetic attempt, really. My bar and patrons would disagree. Brox glanced at the smoking ruin. Survivors? Just us and 2 prisoners. Bo answered. Griff. Mandalorian security finally arrived. Most of them wore either light armors or the ceremonial garb of the palace guards, complete with energy pikes. They took one look at the devastation, the armors worn by my prisoners and Bo, then raised their weapons our way. Drop your weapons and raise your hands. You're under arrest. The man in charge, an LT, ordered us. No, I stated flatly. I'm General Vale, representative of the Galactic Republic and thus covered under diplomatic immunity. Those, I pointed at the captives, are Death Watch agents who just tried to assassinate me. They committed an act of war against the Republic and are prisoners of war. I'm being generous in not assuming that all Mandalorians nowadays are supporters of the Death Watch, a bunch of cowardly thugs, smugglers, pirates and slavers who know no honor. I paused for effect and stared at the LT. Chose your next words very carefully, Lieutenant. What about her? The Mandalorian pointed at Bo-Katan. She's with me. That's not good enough, General. I say it is. I raised my hands and pulled force energies through me. A moment later, electricity arched around my fingers as I prepared to unleash a lightning storm if the local security services proved too bullheaded. I had my doubts that Bo would go quietly and that she would be safe if in custody. Assassinating her while temporarily imprisoned would be much easier. What the crap are you all doing? Brox snapped. Well, I'm not surrendering either myself or one of my associates in the hands of people who might be Death Watch or CIS supporters. Besides, those don't look like they're up to the task of capturing me. I could feel it in their emotions. Most of them are no warriors. I smiled thinly. That's a lie. We're here to uphold Mandalorian law. The LT snapped back. Mandalorian law? I think not. New Mandalorian banned the Pudo? That I'll give you. I smiled. Last time I was here, dealing with a bunch of fools who attacked you while you had a drink in a bar was something no one would have batted an eye at, besides joining the fun and crushing the fools who started the mess. That's been unacceptable ever since the Civil War. Is it, really? I asked, addressing the crowd. So neither of you can legally deal with someone being foolish enough to attack you while you're having a drink or a bite to eat? I thought that I was on Mandalore, surrounded by Mandalorians, but I'm obviously mistaken. There were both laughter and cheers coming from the crowd. One thing was sure, everyone on the planet would soon know about this accident and some of them would start asking pointed questions. Sir, but. I see. The LT spoke to someone over his comm. General Vale, he hissed my name. Your presence has been requested in the Royal Palace. That of your companion too. Well. So Satine would want to slap my wrist for protecting myself. How did she get in charge of Mandalore? I'll never know. These idiots are coming with me to the Republic Embassy and then we'll see what your supposed leader has to say about this mess. I stared at the LT. He listened to someone over his comm and nodded sharply. That will be acceptable. Hey equals. Satine's chambers. Sundari Royal Palace. Sundari. Mandalore. What? This better be important, Satine snapped after she found her comm. Ma'am, there was some kind of an attack in the city. Explosions and heavy blast of fire were reported. I see. Keep me informed. The Duchess cut off the line. I have the strange feeling that Del-Qatar is a part of this. Obi-Wan muttered. The Jedi was lying naked under the sheets next to her. Satine looked at her lover. I should have known, she sighed. That man is a walking disaster zone. True enough. The comm unit chimed again. The Duchess picked it up. Yes, report. We have multiple calls about a Death Watch attack on a place called Brox's Bar. Missiles, grenades, heavy repeater fire. Whatever's happening, it's a war zone down there. We've mobilized quick response units as well as Mandalorian security. Good. Give me a call when you know what exactly is happening. Understood. We better get up, Satine sighed and stood up. The sheet fell from her naked figure and the sight of her body made Kenobi shiver. Yes. That would be prudent. Obi-Wan muttered. He was still trying to figure out did he made a mistake in sleeping with Satine. Though doing it felt anything but wrong. RK equals. Part 4. Sundari Royal Palace. Sundari. Mandalore. I hope the reunion with your sister would go well. I quipped when we reached the palace grounds. Not criffing likely. It's Satine. Bo grumbled. The security personnel surrounding us did their best to pretend they weren't hearing this particular conversation. Well, she couldn't have been this bad when she became the leader of your people. She wouldn't have lived this long if she was. Right? Bo-Katan grumbled something so quiet I couldn't hear it. I didn't catch that. After the war, there were a lot of people who wanted peace and someone who would rebuild in charge. Satine. She got enough support to become our nominal leader, though that was more because many simply didn't care. The rest were either away from our worlds or in the Death Watch. The latter simply didn't have the numbers to be relevant. They took catastrophic losses during the war. I see. Any idea how to make your sister get her head out of her ass? I would prefer that she doesn't get herself killed. Apparently one of my generals is sweet on her. What? Satine with a boyfriend? Hey. Not bloody likely. She's too busy preaching about peace and pacifism, not that many are listening, mind you. Well, Kenobi's a Jedi, the poor bastard, though a dose of Mandalorian culture would serve him well. Many of us don't see Satine as Mandalorian, Bo snapped, then she smiled. A Jedi, eh? That might do it, however I don't know what they would do in bed, discuss philosophy or something? I can see why. I nodded. Obi-Wan isn't a fossil like most of his order, so he might actually know what to do with a woman. I don't buy it. The pair of honor guards protecting the audience chamber gave us sharp nods and opened the doors. They made a halting gesture and the security left us enter without escort. Inside we found Satine on her throne. She was wearing a simple green dress and her hair spilled freely over her shoulders. Obi-Wan and the Prime Minister were flanking her and talking quietly. The Duchess looked our way and froze when she recognized Bo-Katan. I could clearly sense her shock from the doors. Beside that I could feel irritation and frustration coming from her along with sorrow, for the dead I assumed. The Prime Minister, he was concerned and curious. The moment he saw Bo, his concern spiked. Obi-Wan was the most interesting of the trio. The Jedi felt somewhat calmer, more balanced, satisfied even. I could still sense his inner turmoil. While it had been growing ever since I met the man, now it was subdued, a stark contrast from the emotions he radiated during our previous meeting here. How curious. Kenobi recognized my companion, then looked between her and Satine. It took him only a moment to figure it out that they were sisters. My eyes widened. Every time Obi-Wan laid eyes on Satine, I could feel longing and lust coming from the Jedi. The latter was absent just a few hours before, there was simple attraction then. I smiled. Who knew that Obi-Wan had it in him? Unless I was very much mistaken, he got lucky tonight. Bo-Katan, Satine hissed when we reached the throne. Sister. My companion sneered back. I should have known that you would be all over this mess. You always loved to make my life difficult. The Duchess spat. Oh, my. There was no love lost between those two. You two. What the criff were you thinking? Satine glared at me. Vale, you've been here for just a few hours and there's already open warfare on my streets. This is Mandalore. The occasional skirmish is normal. Not under my rule, Satine snapped. Oh? You've been actually ruling? That's a news to me. Del-Katar. What happened? Obi-Wan raised his voice. The usual. I went to a bar to meet a friend. I nodded at Bo-Katan, who smirked. Then the Death Watch decided to try and kill us. It was just like the old times on Mandalore. I grinned. What about you? You're feeling unusually chipper this evening. The Duchess is a bit disheveled and the way you're looking at her. I trailed off. What? I'm just... Obi-Wan spluttered. Yep. Bo nodded. My sister looked like she just got laid. It's been a long time, hasn't it, Satine? And with a Jedi of all people. Bo shook her head in disappointment, though I could feel only amusement coming from her. We didn't. Really? Obi-Wan, I had such trust in you. Are you telling me that you couldn't perform? I'm disappointed in you, my friend. You see, I raised my hands and wigged my fingers. There are fingers, tongue too, and then there's the Force. I grinned, making Kenobi go red, something that was shared by the Duchess. They looked at each other. Oh, that's cute. Did you really think that I wouldn't notice? Enough. The Prime Minister snapped. We aren't here to discuss what the Duchess did or didn't do in her spare time. It's your actions that brought us here. Really? I merely dispatched a group of assassins. The survivors are nicely tucked up in the embassy awaiting interrogation. Instead of doing that and possibly finding a way to break the Death Watch, I'm here. Why? General Vale. Satine glared at me. You're threading a thin line. Your actions today are grounds to declare you a persona non grata and throw you out of Mandalorian space. You won't, I sneered back. If you do, I'll consider Mandalore a clear and present danger to the Republic and remove it as such. Satine recoiled at my words and Obi-Wan blanched. You're serious? Kenobi muttered. I was hoping that you would talk some sense in the Duchess before trying to seduce her. Or did she seduce you? I shrugged. There's only one outcome that might keep your worlds and people reasonably intact, Duchess, it's an alliance with the Republic. Anything else is unacceptable. I took a deep breath. Bo, she's your sister, try talking some sense in her. She never listens. My companion protested. Try anyway. Kenobi, a word. I waved the Jedi to follow and headed to the crystal windows covering the left side of the chambers.